Okay, we're going to wrap up our discussion of the nervous system by looking at the parts and basic functions of the central, peripheral, and limbic nervous systems. The central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cords and the many neurons that make up those two pieces. The CNS, or central nervous system, receives the information from both the external and internal environment and then initiates motor movements to respond to that information. We know from experience how fast we're able to respond to external stimuli, so that gives you an idea about how fast those nerve signals travel from neuron to neuron. Your reaction time is something that you'll get to test in your lab for this week. And that's what you're really testing, is how fast your neurons are able to work and how fast your brain is able to process information. Hopefully, we recall from our discussion of nervous tissue that neurons are not regenerative, and once lost, they're unlikely really to replace themselves. We saw when we looked at the skeletal system that the first layer of protection for our brain and the skull is the skull, and for our spinal cord is the vertebrae. Because these are such important organs to maintain body functions, there are, of course, even more layers of protection. Around the brain, we have the meninges and the cerebrospinal fluid that act as that second layers of protection after the skull. The meninges are 3 layers of connective tissue that surround the entire brain and the spinal cord. And then in between each layer, or each meninge, we're going to find cerebrospinal fluid. And this creates like a fluid-like consistency that the brain and spinal cord are kind of floating in. And this acts as a shock absorber in case the body is hit and prevents the brain from knocking up against the skull. These layers are also what creates the blood-brain barrier, which is highly, highly, highly selective about what can cross these membranes and enter the brain and enter the bloodstream into the brain. So that's going to be things like bacteria and viruses. We do not want to allow anything that can cause a serious infection into the part of our body that controls the rest of the body, right? If you ever get meningitis, which hopefully we don't, a lot of us get vaccinated against that now, but meningitis is an infection of the meninges, and that's why it can cause swelling on the brain and be potentially deadly. There's a section of your book, 14.2, that goes through each lobe of your brain and describes what functions each one is responsible for coordinating, and this is something that you'll need to look at to complete your lab for this week. So make sure you can crack your book open for that. All right, the peripheral nervous system carries information between the central nervous system and the rest of the body. It consists of 31 pairs of spinal nerves and 12 pairs of cranial nerves. So our spinal nerves are going to be the ones that are coming off of the spinal cord and carrying those messages, either if a stimulus is expressed out here, it's going to be carrying it to the central nervous system and up to the brain to tell the body what to do. Each pair of spinal nerves starts in the spinal cord and sends messages to a specific region of the body. So spinal nerves include both sensory and motor neurons because they have to be able to send messages to the brain and receive the message back from the brain. The cranial nerves originate in the brain, so they're going to be like way up here, kind of off of this picture. And they send messages to certain parts of the body like the heart and the diaphragm. And this is what helps to maintain processes that are automatic. So pumping of our heart, breathing, and ventilation. The peripheral nervous system also includes both the somatic nervous system and the automatic nervous system. The somatic nervous system carries messages that tell about the internal and external environment. and these control movement in response to those stimuli. These can result in voluntary actions like smiling, waving, or talking, and these are functions that use the spinal nerves. But the automatic nervous system, on the other hand, is what automatically adjusts the functioning of our bodies to maintain those homeostases that we mentioned before. The pumping of our heart and the ventilation of our lungs. And these functions are what are done by the cranial nerves. The last portion of the nervous system that we're going to cover as part of this class is the limbic nervous system, which is composed of several portions of the brain that are located at the very center. And these work together to blend emotions with higher mental functions so that we can experience things kind of as a whole. This is really an evolutionary advanced trait that far fewer animals possess, and humans certainly have the most sophisticated limbic nervous systems. The amygdala, down here, the amygdala is what allows us to have experiences and then associate them with specific emotions. And this is also what gives us the ability to feel fear. So it allows us to use past knowledge from previous experiences to assess how we might feel about a new situation. And this is kind of where our fight or flight response comes from. Luckily for us, the brain does have a check on the amygdala, so that we're not always acting on our initial emotions. So I think we can all agree that that would be kind of dangerous. The frontal lobe can override the limbic system and allows us to kind of rethink a situation and choose a different response. We often have this stereotype of adolescents as being kind of irrational and not having a check on their emotions. And in some ways, that's kind of biologically accurate, because the frontal lobe, that check on the amygdala, that check on acting on our emotions, doesn't become fully developed until we're pretty well into adulthood. The second part that's included in the limbic nervous system is the hippocampus. So right down here next to the amygdala is the hippocampus, and this plays a major role in learning and memory. And as we know, our memories are an important part of our decision-making process. So your hippocampus is probably getting a workout when you study for this class and hopefully working to learn and remember all of this information. It's also the limbic system that stores our knowledge of numbers and words in our long-term memory, which will give us the ability for both language and speech, which is obviously a very important human trait. Okay. So that completes our discussion of Chapter 14 over the nervous system. If you have any questions, make sure that you're reaching out.